Yeah, welcome to the final session of our conference. And our next speaker is Patricia Kitcher of Columbia University. And the title of her presentation is Leibniz, Hume and Kant on How Minds Know Their Identity. Thank you.
Thanks. There should be a handout. That's simply the texts so that you can keep me honest that Kant says roughly what I say he's saying. But anyway, so this isn't exactly what I think we were supposed to be doing in terms of minds in dialogues, but there will be a moment when I will talk a little bit more about that, and you'll sort of see why my talk has the structure it does. Okay, so Leibniz, Hume, and Kant on how minds know their identities. Section 1, why Kant has a theory of mind. Kant's most important projects, all right, let me just pause here. Can you hear me? Okay, so holler if you can't, okay. Kant's most important projects were to explain the possibility of cognition and the possibility of morality. Like many modern philosophers, he did so by examining the faculties that a creature must have to be capable of cognition and to be capable of morally correct action. Given the centrality of freedom to Kant's entire philosophy, it is tempting to think that the moral mind, or moral self, should have pride of place in his philosophy of mind. But it does not. Kant is clear that in creatures with higher powers, the employment of all powers, including powers required for morality, it does not. Kant is clear that in creatures with higher powers, the employment of all powers, including the powers responsible for morality, is based on the cognitive power. So the place to enter his philosophy of mind is his theory of the cognitive mind. The theory emerges from his analysis of the conditions under which cognition is possible. The last 20 years have brought important clarification to our understanding of the regress. It cannot be characterized as a regress from empirical knowledge because the critique does not take up knowledge as normally understood in terms of adequately justified belief until the canon, long after the deduction of the categories. I follow Eric Watkins and Marcus Wilczek, who argue convincingly that the quote-unquote proper cognition, that's A78, B103, from which Kant regresses is, and this is the first quote, here I'm quoting Watkins and Wilczek. All right, so they argue convincingly that the proper cognition from which Kant regresses arises when one determines an object given an intuition by applying a concept to it, as when one judges or is conscious, say, of a ball in front of one as red. As they explain, regressing from cognition involving two types of representations leads to the necessity of two faculties that differ in kind: a passive faculty for receiving representations through sensory engagement with objects, and a faculty for judging according to concepts. Watkins and Wilczek make the now standard assumption that Kant's characterization of the faculties required for cognition is functional. They do what is required for cognition. In the A preface, Kant explains that the transcendental deduction has two sides. The subjective side examines the understanding and its possibility, including the cognitive powers that underlie it. Then he qualifies. He is not trying to explain how the power of thought is possible, since that would be to offer a hypothetical cause for an effect. Kant's distinctive result was that besides faculties of sense, imagination, understanding, and self-consciousness, cognition requires what he calls the unity of apperception. As everybody realizes, we cannot understand Kant's theory of the cognitive mind until we can figure out what he means by the unity of self-consciousness. Although there is still no agreement on the matter, I think there's significant convergence on related issues. I will argue for three claims. First, despite many careful examinations of the transcendental deduction, there's a key moment in the B deduction where Kant is not merely regressing from the necessary conditions for cognition, but taking a positive step. And that passage has been neglected. Taking the passage seriously leads to a plausible account of unity. Second, we can understand the positive step better if we see Kant as drawing on, but also quarreling with, Leibniz's account of how minds know their identities, and as partially accepting and partially rejecting Hume's denial of the possibility of knowing yourself to be identical. Third, the recent attempts to understand the unity of apperception in Aristotelian terms of realizing the unifying power of apperception err in offering hypotheses about the functionally delineated faculties required for cognition. And if you're not aware of this, there's quite a few people who are running this Aristotelian line. Okay, section 2. Leibniz's theory of knowing your mind's identity and Hume's denial of the possibility of knowing it. In the new Essays on Human Understanding, Leibniz distinguishes the metaphysical unity of the self, which is a matter of the soul substance striving for a new perception from a present one, from the unity that selves know themselves to have. Criticizing Locke, Leibniz argues that the unity that selves recognize themselves to possess cannot exist separately from metaphysical unity. Quoting Leibniz here, according to the order of things, an identity which is apparent to the person concerned, one who senses himself to be the same, presupposes a real identity, obtaining through each immediate temporal transition accompanied by reflection, or by the sense of I, because an intimate and immediate perception cannot be mistaken in the natural course of things. What is an intimate and immediate perception? Christian Barth characterizes it in terms of a subject actively attending to a thought occurring immediately before the reflective act. It is not a recalling of an act of thought, but reflecting on an act that one presently has. Leibniz explains how intimate and immediate perception provides a basis for apparent identity. To discover one's own moral identity unaided, it is sufficient that between one state and a neighboring, or just nearby one, there is a mediating bond of consciousness, even if this has a jump or forgotten interval mixed into it. The mediating bond of consciousness is provided by the subject's intimate and immediate perception of her states. Leibniz's idea, I think, is that subjects acquire a sense of their identity because they can attend to their thoughts, which involve multiple states in what we would now call the specious present. In immediately attending to what she is presently thinking, a subject's act of attention spreads over several states, so the objects of attention are different states of the same self that attends to them. That's how this is self-knowledge or self-consciousness. Leibniz goes on to maintain that, quoting again, the existence of real personal identity is proved with as much certainty as any matter of fact can be by present and immediate reflection. It is proved conclusively enough for ordinary purposes by memories across intervals and by the concurring testimony of other people. Given that no fact can be proved with greater certainty, the identity established by intimate and immediate perception enjoys Cartesian certainty, and it does so for the same reason that I think does. Thinkers cannot be mistaken about their immediate thinking activity. With this argument, Leibniz explains how ordinary cognizers have a sense of identity by basically expanding the aperture of Cartesian certainty to a train of states. Subjects take themselves to be the same across different states because when they attend to their thinking, they are conscious of those states in the specious present. This provides them with not only an idea of their identity, but an unshakable conviction of it. Leibniz thereby extends Cartesian indubitability from the activity of thinking to the sameness of the thinking I across different states. He does not take all states or representations to be conscious, let alone objects of intimate and immediate perception. The last part of the citation indicates that memory and the testimony of others have roles to play in establishing identity. As we see below, Kant also invokes the indubitability of thinking in arguing for the identity of the I across different representations. And he maintains that the identity of a cognitive self extends beyond what can be established through indubitable conscious acts of thinking. This is no news here. Hume denied the unity of cognitive selves. The current scholarly consensus includes 3 claims about the relations between Kant and Hume on this issue. First, there were ample sources for Kant to learn about Hume's views. Second, Kant agreed with Hume about the absence of an intuition of a self. Third, Kant's appreciation of the lack of such an intuition plays an important role in the transcendental deduction and in the paralogisms. It is important to realize, however, that Hume believed that the idea of a unitary or identical cognitive self could be established in 2 ways, either by tracing it back to an impression of a self or by finding a real bond or necessary connection across representations. Quoting Hume, "Notwithstanding their distinction and separability, we suppose the whole train of perceptions to be united by identity. So a question naturally arises concerning this relation of identity. Whether it be something that really binds our several perceptions together or only associates their ideas in the imagination. Whether in pronouncing concerning the identity of a person, we observe some real bond among his perceptions. This question we might easily decide if we would recollect what has already been proven at large, that the understanding never observes any real connection among objects." Hume's rejection of the idea of an identical self also depends on his claim that it is impossible to establish relations of real or necessary connection across representations. If Kant accepts Hume's 2 options for establishing legitimacy, then he could vindicate the notion of a unitary mind by showing that representations are necessarily connected to each other. Further, Hume and Kant agree on the relation, Hume and Kant agree that real or necessary connection is a relation of existential dependence. A is really connected to B, just in case it is impossible for A to exist in the absence of B. Did Hume's denial of the second means of legitimating the idea of a cognitive self also affect Kant? Here I'm going to skip a little bit of Tayton's. As Kant embarks on the arguments of the A deduction, he makes it clear that if Hume's idea were an accurate representation of an I, then cognition would be impossible. Quoting from Kant, "If each singular representation were entirely foreign to, isolated from, as it were, every other representation and separated from it, there would never arise anything like cognition, for cognition is a whole consisting of compared and connected representations." Kant does not mention Hume, but he's rejecting a doctrine linked to him. As we will see, he argues that what enables subjects to represent mental states as belonging to a single consciousness is a relation of real connection across them produced through cognizing. So I didn't say, all right, so all the quotes that don't say who it's from is obviously from Kant, right? Okay. All right, so the regress. Yeah, I've got this like as if they're going to be equal time for all these guys. Not true. It's going to be all about Kant, always is. All right, section 3, the regress. Since in the simplest case, cognition is a matter of ascribing some property to some object, it requires reference to an object. Just before introducing the unity of apperception in the A edition, Kant explains how reference to an object must work by clarifying what it means to say that something is an object of representations. Quoting again, excuse me, "Our thought of the reference of all cognition to an object carries with it something concerning necessity. It does so inasmuch as this object is regarded as what keeps our cognitions from being determined haphazardly or arbitrarily. The unity that an object makes necessary can be nothing other than the formal unity of consciousness in the synthesis of the manifold of representations. When we have brought about a synthetic unity in the manifold of intuition, this is when we say we have cognized the object. Having taught this many times, including to someone who's present, I read this in Kant says, see, so we see what the reference to an object is, it's the unity of consciousness. And they go, what? Anyway, this will all be clear, maybe. All right, so the reference of different representations to an object cannot be established by examining an object outside of our power of representation. Yet they cannot be understood as representations of a single object unless they agree in something, and that something can only be a representation. So it can only be a more encompassing representation that includes them all. A representation that includes or encompasses others a representation includes or encompasses others only by being synthesized from them. Thus, different representations can be said to refer to a single object only if they are understood as the representations of a single subject. In paragraph 17 of the B deduction, Kant offers the same argument that referring representations to an object requires the unity of consciousness. Quoting again, by the way, I've had to clean up this quote a little bit the way it's on your handout. Quoting again, cognitions consist in determinate reference of representations to an object, and an object is that in whose concept the manifold of a given intuition is united. But all unification of representations requires that there be a unity of consciousness in the synthesis of them. Consequently, the reference of representations to an object consists solely in this unity of consciousness. Now, it may seem backwards that the regress from the possibility of objective cognition comes after the argument, the famous argument for the unity of apperception in paragraph 16, rather than before it, as it does in A. Notice, however, that the A argument accounts for the necessity of the unity of consciousness only by presupposing the necessity of synthesizing one representation from others. I think the B deduction tacitly acknowledges this dependency by beginning with the necessity of combination to cognition in paragraph 15. There, Kant notes that as the faculty that receives representations, sensibility cannot also combine them. Rather, that requires a spontaneous or active faculty, which he calls the understanding. He then explains that whether the understanding combines intuitions or concepts, whether it does so consciously or unconsciously, quote, we cannot represent anything as combined in the object without ourselves having combined it beforehand. This doctrine is of a piece with the shocking claim he makes next. Analysis presupposes synthesis. With this claim, Kant upends one pillar of Leibniz's philosophy, the principle that all truths are analytic. Although Kant does not elaborate, I take his argument to be that the practice of analyzing concepts implies that rationalists take them to be complex. Since empiricists also try to explain how complex concepts are formed through the association of simple elements, his two opponents agree that cognition requires at least conceptual cognition requires representations that are combinations. He then turns to the project of explicating the concept of combination. Quoting, the concept of combination carries with it, besides the concept of the manifold and its synthesis, also the concept of the manifold's unity. Combination is the representation of the synthetic unity of the manifold. Hence, the representation of this unity cannot arise from combination. Rather, by being added to the representation of the manifold, it makes the concept possible in the first place. This unity, which thus precedes a priori all concepts of combination, is by no means the category or concept of unity. Rather, it must be sought higher up than the categories, in what itself contains the basis for the unity of different concepts in judgments. In many places, Kant explains that cognition is possible only if representations are combined according to rules. What he is saying here is that rules do not suffice for the possibility of cognition. Rather, the rules, which he sometimes describes as functions of unity because they're supposed to unify, they can unify cognition only if there is some higher unity. Since the topic of paragraph 16 is the original synthetic unity of apperception or self-consciousness, we know what representation must be added to the concept of the manifold and its synthesis to make the concept of combination possible. But this is of no help until we have some idea what the original synthetic unity is. All right, section 4, Kant's argument for the unity of apperception. Let me just pause and take a drink before we get to the denouement here. Okay, section 4. Kant opens paragraph 16 with the famous claim that the representation I think must be able to accompany all representations that can be part of cognition. He is not asserting merely that all representations must belong to a single thinking subject. He has arguments to show that cognizers can refer different representations to the same object only if they can refer them to a common subject. As we've just seen, in setting up the argument in paragraph 15, he explains that understanding something as a combination requires some further representation beyond those of the manifold of representations and its synthesis. Oddly, at this pivotal moment in paragraph 16 of the B deduction, Kant does not argue that combination requires the representation of an identical self, but that the representation of an identical self requires combination. As we will see, however, the argument showing that the representation of an identical self requires combining also establishes that any representation of combination must include that of an identical self. Kant begins the argument by rejecting previous accounts of subjects' ability to represent themselves as identical, quoting, "The empirical consciousness that accompanies different representations is intrinsically sporadic and without any reference to the subject's identity. Since Locke introduced the idea of an accompanying consciousness, Kant's objection could be to his account. It could also be to Leibniz's recently published account of how a bond of consciousness enables the ordinary person to recognize her identity across different representations. I think it's probably both. Although Kant's criticism of Locke does not address memory, it makes sense considering his transcendental project. It is irrelevant that all representations must be accompanied by consciousness, because that does not imply that they all must be accompanied by the same consciousness or a common consciousness. Leibniz's account is closer to Kant's because, like combining, attending to, or apperceiving a perception is an activity performed by the self. Still, Leibniz's observation does not fit Kant's project either, because such a unity of apperceptive consciousness would not make cognition possible. Taking Kant's counting example from the A deduction, being conscious of stroke symbols, I need a blackboard here, 1, 2, 3, 4, okay. Being conscious of different stroke symbols in the specious present may be a necessary condition for cognition, but it is insufficient to explain how subjects understand the representations to represent a common object, namely a set of 4 things. For that, subjects must also be conscious of the representation 4 as the effect of their act of counting. By contrast, Kant's original definition of synthesis, alluded to earlier, and its reiteration in paragraph 15, present it as an activity that is tailor-made to explain how different representations can be understood as representing a single object. Quoting, "By synthesis, in the most general sense of the term, I mean the act of adding different representations to one another and of comprehending their multiplicity in one cognition." Let me just pause a second. Boy, this is not a new idea with Kant, right? Everybody's combining representations, everybody's adding representations. I mean, anyway, it's very interesting for me to hear the earlier papers on this topic. Not as original as I thought here. Anyway, all right, so we've got what synthesis is. He's adding these things together and comprehending their multiplicity in one cognition. So synthesis is an activity that incorporates elements from different representations in a single representation or cognition. The second elucidation of synthesis in paragraph 15, partially presented above or earlier, is more explicit. I would assign to this act of understanding the general name synthesis in order to point out at the same time that we cannot represent anything as combined in the object without ourselves having combined it beforehand. Putting this point positively, describing an activity as a synthesis indicates that it is a representation of an object with multiple properties that was produced by a subject who combined elements from different representations in it. With this understanding of synthesis or combination in view, we can turn to Kant's positive account of how subjects are able to represent their unity and so attach, I think, to representations. Quoting again, this reference to an identical subject comes about through my adding one representation to the other and being conscious of their synthesis. Hence, only because I can combine a manifold of given representations in one consciousness, is it possible for me to represent the identity itself of the consciousness in these representations. I agree with Henry Allison that being conscious of their synthesis should be understood as indicating that a subject is conscious of both the activity of synthesizing and its product or effect. Kant's view is that subjects can represent the same I think in different representations only by consciously synthesizing those representations in another representation, which is how they are conscious of the latter representation as a combination. Why does Kant refer to given representations in discussing conscious combination? He's explicit that the representations that subjects are given are sensations or intuitions, and that the synthesis of intuitions out of sensations is performed by the blind faculty of imagination, and so is unconscious. I think we can remove the incongruity by recalling that Kant agrees with his empiricist foes that all material elements in representations come in through the senses. When we are dealing with proper cognition and the conscious synthesis of the understanding, say in the judgment, the ball is red, then the contents of those representations must have been supplied by sensations or intuitions. Thus, conscious syntheses include elements that were themselves produced by unconscious syntheses of elements. As noted, Kant and the empiricists agree further that sensibility receives disparate elements that must be brought together in concepts. The point at issue is whether the bringing together is a matter of association or active combining. Kant argues in both deductions that the empiricist alternative is inadequate to explain the reference of different representations to a common object. In paragraph 16, he offers what I think of as his master argument. Active combining is necessary because, one, cognition is possible only if different representations can be represented as belonging to a common consciousness, and two, subjects can represent their identities across different representations only through conscious combining. Although the argument for one is regressive, the argument for two cannot be. Kant cannot establish that subjects can represent their identities only through conscious combining unless he has some way of demonstrating that conscious combining gives rise to the representation of an identical or unified consciousness. So the question is, and this I think the question that hasn't been asked in all the many studies of the deduction, the question is, how does conscious combining enable subjects to refer representations to a single consciousness? What is the subject conscious of as she combines the representations ball and red in the representation the ball is red? Through this conscious combination, the subject understands that she has produced a representation with a certain content, the ball is red, by combining representations with the content red and ball, and hence that state would not exist had the states with the contents ball and red not existed, or had her power of thought not combined them. In this way, subjects grasp that the different states are existentially or necessarily connected to each other by their power of combination to produce some representations from others. Later, in paragraph 25 of the B deduction, Kant draws attention to an important part of this result. Conscious combination enables the subject to be conscious of herself as active, to be conscious of the fact that she thinks. Quoting again, "I exist as an intelligence which is conscious solely of its power of combination." Through inviting readers to attend to their activity of conscious synthesizing, Kant can establish, with Cartesian certainty, two key claims against empiricism. Proper cognition is a matter of actively combining representations, and, against Hume, different representations belong to a common subject. So he argues, in opposition to Hume and in agreement with Leibniz, that far from being erroneous, ordinary cognizers' sense of their identity is as certain as any matter of fact can be. That seems to me a good result to get, by the way. Anyway, as the source of the representation of different representations as belonging to a common consciousness, conscious combination also supplies the expression with its meaning. Quoting again, "The thought that representations given in intuition, one and all belong to me, means Heist. As much, therefore, as that I unite them in one self-consciousness, or at least can unite them in one self-consciousness. And although that thought itself is not yet the consciousness of the synthesis of the representations, it still presupposes the possibility of that synthesis." Through consciously combining representations, subjects are conscious of their power to connect representations, and they come to understand that any representation that they can connect with a representation of which they are currently conscious, e.g. the ball is red, also belongs to them. In this respect, Kant's account has a similar structure to Locke's. Locke maintained that ideas belong to the same self, not just if a present consciousness remembers them, but if it can remember them. But it's also like Leibniz's position that subjects' conviction of their identity across different representations is unshakable at its core, but that the identity extends beyond what they can be certain of or even conscious of. Kant continues by drawing an even stronger conclusion about the relation between active combining and the unity of self-consciousness. Quoting, "Hence, synthetic unity of the manifold of intuition, as given a priori, is the basis or ground of the identity itself of apperception. Unless intuitions given through sensibility were unified, there would be no synthetic unity of apperception." It seems to me that's just what he's saying there. The contrast here with Leibniz is stark. For Leibniz, real personal identity across different perceptions depends on a soul substance producing the perceptions from itself. Although the identity known to a subject through bonds of consciousness is conclusive proof of real identity, it must be distinguished from that identity. By contrast, for Kant, combination is both the ground of the self's knowledge of its identity and the grounds of its self-identity. So you can see Kant's position relates to some of the things we were talking about earlier, but anyway. Returning to paragraph 15, we can answer Kant's question. The representation of the manifold's unity that needs to be added to the concept of its multiplicity and its synthesis for a representation to be a combination is its being produced by a subject combining other representations in it, which representations are thereby understood as belonging to a common subject. That is why the concept of combination implies that of an identical self. The higher unity that is common to all functions of understanding is the representation of a subject who produces cognitions by combining other representations. Kant illustrates the universality of this condition by noting that even using the rule of identity requires synthetic unity. Consider the judgment A equals A. Quoting again, "The consciousness of the one representation, say the right-hand side A, can always be distinguished from the consciousness of the other representation, say the left-hand side A. And what matters here is solely the synthesis of this possible consciousness. Although rational cognizers must employ the principle of identity, they can do so only by comparing and connecting two content-identical representations in a cognition that is understood as the effect of their activities. Hence, even the paradigmatic analytic judgment requires the synthetic unity of apperception. Having offered a novel reading of the unity of apperception, I'm going to try to defend it. I think I've got time to do that. By contrasting it with this Aristotelian account that Steve Engstrom, Houston Schmidt, Thomas Pendlebury, I'm just going to do Steve Engstrom's because I haven't got time. Okay. So reading Kant through Aristotle, but as I think they would all agree, they have very, very similar views. Okay, reading Kant through Aristotle, the last section. A passage in paragraph 15 that I have not cited provides strong evidence for Engstrom's reading. Just after noting that we cannot represent anything as combined in the object without having combined it beforehand, Kant writes, "We readily become aware here that this act of synthesis must originally be a single act and must hold for all combination, and that resolution or analysis, which seems to be its opposite, yet always presupposes it." Despite Kant's suggestion this point is obvious, I must say I've never found it the slightest bit obvious. It's quite striking, however. Engstrom characterizes the original synthetic act as primordial, and he argues that that is the position that Kant presents in paragraph 15. So here I'm quoting from Engstrom. "The original synthetic unity is said to be prior to any particular act of combination. Kant states explicitly that the unity in question is presupposed in acts of synthesis. The representation of synthetic unity does not result from combination, but rather is presupposed by it, and it is therefore necessarily presupposed in any spontaneous act of combination." Engstrom knows full well that prior doesn't indicate temporal but logical priority. To take a relevant example, representations cannot be connected unless they're connectable, but that does not mean that they must be connectable before they're connected. As Engstrom observes in a footnote, Kant's claim is not about connection or connectability, but about the representation of combination. And the last claim in the previous citation maintains that a spontaneous act of combination presupposes a representation of synthetic unity. The note, that Steve Engstrom's note, reinforces the claim. It is only in accordance with this representation of unity that the combination can take place. Returning to the example, Engstrom's view would be that a cognizer could not see or judge a ball to be red without assuming that her thoughts about a ball and its redness can be combined in a further thought. On this point, Engstrom would agree with Gareth Evans and many others that using predicates like ball and red requires that the subject have some appreciation of, for example, the range of concepts that red can be combined with. In that case, judging that the ball is red would presuppose the connectability of the predicates. But doesn't Evans' doctrine presuppose a version of the claim that Engstrom rightly sees Kant as denying, namely the Leibnizian view that analytic claims are prior to synthetic ones? Honoring Kant's denial, which Engstrom wants to do, which all these guys want to do, honoring Kant's denial implies that the sort of relations that Evans sees across predicates are the result of combining representations and not a precondition to them. For Kant, at the most basic level, relations across representations are a function of how the understanding combines representations, which is why he says after defining synthesis that, quote, "If we want to make a judgment about the first origin of our cognition, then we must first direct our attention to synthesis." My reading may seem heretical. Kant insists that he is not considering how humans do think, but how they ought to think. On the other hand, he also takes the Porphyrian structure, the genus-species structure of concepts to be the result of reason's natural tendency to seek completeness. And he regards the task of scientific logicians to be the explication and tidying up of the logical principles by which cognizers' minds actually operate. What Kant is saying here, I think, is that cognition can begin only if there are some natural ways of combining representations that enable cognizers to understand the result of their combining as such, as the effect of their combining activities. Kant's point about the impossibility of abstracting the concept of combination from combinations is simply a consequence of his claim that the concept of combination includes, besides the concepts of empirical manifolds and syntheses, the concept of synthetic unity, the concept of one representation being produced from others, which it incorporates. This a priori content is supplied by the activity of the mind. Its a priori status as produced by the mind is highlighted in paragraph 16. Absent this a priori content, subjects cannot represent anything as a combination, so there would be no representations of combination from which they could abstract common elements. Engström's account is complex, and I cannot treat it in the detail it deserves, so I'm just going to make 3 objections. First of all, Engström runs up against Kant's prohibition about making hypotheses about how the faculty of thought is possible. Given Kant's theory, cognition will be possible only if subjects are given representations that are connectable by categorical principles. But that does not imply that they must be made connectable by an original act. Further, if the concern is that given materials might be inapt for combination by categorical principles, why doesn't the problem recur at the next level? Couldn't they also be inapt for being made connectable by an original act? At some point, push is going to come to shove here, and reason's ability to cognize through its innate ways of combining representations must encounter sensory materials that can be so combined. Finally, although the passage from paragraph 15 can be read as supporting the idea of cognition presupposing a single act of apperception, the crucial argument of paragraph 16, where the unity of apperception is established, highlights conscious combination, and this discussion plays no role in the Aristotelian reading. Now I'm going to skip a whole bunch of stuff where I was actually going to try to explain how the original act works. I'm just going to conclude very quickly. All right, so Steve Engström could reply to what I've complained about here by saying, look, while I've criticized his Aristotelian account as metaphysically too robust, on my account, Kant's thinker is metaphysically too weak. As I understand Kant, his theory of the cognitive mind is that it is a thing with faculties for receiving representations and consciously combining them, and which enjoys a real unity that is brought about and recognized as such through its conscious combining. Kant worried a lot about the charge that his theory makes the thinking self into an appearance, and my reading may seem to exacerbate the problem, since it includes just representations, relations across representations, and functionally defined faculties. So it's beginning to look a little unreal here, but. All right, so Kant addresses this issue of the unreality in paragraphs 24 and 25 of the B deduction. Paragraph 24 contrasts apperception and inner sense, noting that the latter presents the self only as an appearance. The next paragraph begins, by contrast, in the transcendental synthesis of the manifold of representations as such, and hence in the synthetic unity of apperception, I am not conscious of myself as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself, but am conscious only that I am. This claim seems kind of hard to interpret since Kant has ontological space only for appearances and things in themselves. He continues, although my existence is not appearance, still less mere illusion, determination of my existence can occur only in conformity with the form of inner sense. Kant adds a footnote explaining that since cognizers do not have a second mode of self-intuition that gives the determining in me, I cannot determine myself as a self-active being. So what he is saying, and again, this is a theme we've seen before, what he is saying is that although a cognizer is certain through thinking, combining that she exists, that she is real, she does not know the way in which she exists. In the general comment at the end of the paralogisms, Kant repeats this crucial point. By thought in general, I represent myself to myself, neither as I am, nor as I appear to myself, but think myself only as I think any object as such, i.e., any object from whose kind of intuition I abstract. If I here represent myself as a subject of thoughts, or for that matter, the basis of thought, then these ways of representing do not signify the categories of substance and cause. Here, however, I only want to become conscious of myself as thinking. The self could indeed be merely an appearance to me who think, but not insofar as I think. In the consciousness of myself, in mere thought, I am the being itself. Kant seems to be strongly affirming the Cartesian certainty of thought. When I am thinking, I am certain that I am thinking. There is no inference from thinking to existing, but to an absolute certainty of existing thinking. It follows that mental representations are real for Kant. Here we need to carefully separate, as he does, the cognitive use of representations, the act of combining of them through spontaneous faculties, and the reporting of them through inner sense, which involves the form of time. Mental representations are appearances only when they have been ordered in temporal relations. Since a cognizer's power of combination creates relations of existential dependence across them, then by both Hume's and Kant's lights, the representations would be really connected in a real cognitive self. So the representations are real, and the relations among them, across them, are real. What about the functionally defined faculties? Christina Engelhardt has recently suggested that Kant agrees with Crusius that in seeing Vermögen, I don't know how to get out of this other than just to do the German, in seeing Vermögen as functionally defined, that's the usual term he's using, faculty, seeing Vermögen as functionally defined capacities that are, let me back up here. All right, Christina Engelhardt has recently suggested that Kant agrees with Crusius in seeing Vermögen as functionally defined functionally defined capacities that are epistemically accessible through their effects, but not as Kräfte, real power properties that produce actions. Crusius despaired of finding simple Kräfte. Kant maintains that once you've gotten to the most basic faculties, Vermögen, that cannot be derived from others, then you can go no further. Still, I'm not sure that doubting that simple Kräfte can be found, or even being convinced that science can go no further than the most basic Vermögen, implies that the Vermögen required for cognition are fictional. How can they be fictional when their effects, thoughts about objects, are known to be real with Cartesian certainty? As is now evident, insofar as one does not offer hypotheses, but stays with functionally characterized faculties, it seems to me that this is how the attempt to explain the possibility of cognition must end, just with the most basic functionally defined cognitive faculties. So, did I go over? I'm finished.